I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS, a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. A couple of weeks ago, I was talking with Cameron about this statistic that I heard recently stating that for every hour of programming, it takes 10 hours to produce a podcast. So, 10 hours of work go into 1 hour of audio. This episode is coming out very late because I feel like I have produced about a month's worth of episodes this week preparing for it. But I think it will be worth it. Before I say anything else, I should just offer a thank you and an unconditional immunity to Alexis, Ethan, and Shane. Alexis, Ethan, and Shane all independently sent me material that was very helpful in researching this week's episode. I think they all have different perspectives on the question. They didn't send me the same material. It was non-overlapping pieces of information, and I found a whole lot more besides. But I just wanted to thank them now before I say anything else. Also to make clear that they are on the hook for nothing I say. And I suspect that they all would disagree with me in a variety of ways. So they get credit simply for helping with the prep for this episode, sending me some information, even apart from thinking there was an episode in it. They were just sending me some things they thought were interesting. So thank you, and te absolvo, I think is the Latin. So the original working title of this episode was The Wrongful Cancellation of a Talentless Prick. And I liked that title. And I kind of feel like I could stand behind it still. But I decided to change it specifically because I didn't want to spend the whole episode basically defending 2.5 of those 4 claims, right? There are 4 claims in that working title: wrongful, cancellation, talentless, and prick. I think the least controversial claim is that the person this episode is about is a prick. I think pretty much everybody, including him, would agree, at least for much of his life, much of the period that this episode concerns. He's a prick. That's fairly uncontroversial. I think cancellation is the next is slightly more controversial in that you could argue that this wasn't a cancellation. I think that would be hard to argue. Then I think there's some debate over talentless, and then I think there would be a lot of debate over wrongful. And I think what it came down to for me is that I realized in thinking about this that I was going to spend a whole lot of the episode basically saying he deserved this, but it wasn't done well. Right? Like, you framed a guilty man, basically. And I think that's kind of that's an argument that gets tiresome pretty quickly. So maybe I'll just say this. I think cancellation is like chemotherapy. Like, clearly there have been some very, very bad things that it turned out chemotherapy was the only real way to get at, right? Not always, but in some cases, it's a corrosive, noxious, poisonous, ugly treatment that in some cases produces an uncontroversially good result. But it felt for a number of years like there were only 3 opinions you could say in public about chemotherapy, right? Depending on which part of the internet you were on, depending on who you were with. And these 3 opinions basically were: chemotherapy is always a good idea, no matter what you're sick with, right? Or chemotherapy is never a good idea. Or chemotherapy, that's not real. I mean, come on now. No one ever really gets chemotherapy. So I think like there's probably, I don't want to debate cancellation any further than that. Instead, I thought I would tell this story because I think it's had a fair amount of coverage, at first from progressive-leaning outlets, and then more recently from conservative-leaning outlets. And I think like two things. One, either half of those, like in either case, they end up leaving out a lot of important information. Right, the progressive coverage leaves out some really important information on the one hand. The conservative coverage leaves out important information on the other hand. But I would say all of them collectively make a huge mistake about this story. On the one hand, they say this is a story about terrible individual behavior. And on the other hand, they say this is a story about terrible collective behavior. And I think it's a story about something slightly different. I think there's a different root cause to this whole mess. In case you have not yet sussed it out, I am talking about the Joseph Massey scandal. So how am I going to tell this story? Yeah, I have like many, many pages of notes, and I even have a 4-page single-spaced timeline that I wrote up for all of the events here. So Joseph Massey is a poet. He was born in 1978 in Delaware. He moved around through in the Northeast. He also lived in California for a little while. It's not a point of contention in the story, but I think, maybe it's meaningful information nonetheless. He did have an extreme, as he, was openly spoken about, he had an extremely chaotic and deeply abusive childhood. In pretty awful terms. He got into poetry in middle school and corresponded when he was 15. He corresponded with Allen Ginsberg. Ginsberg wrote him encouraging notes about his poems. And he decided he was a poet. And at 24, he publishes his first chapbook. He sends that chapbook out to a number of people. I think this was when he was in California. So he sends it out to people he admired. I think really the first breakthrough is this for him in his career. He sends it to Ray Armantrout. And what Ray Armantrout does is she writes a note to Ron Silliman. So Ray Armantrout and Ron Silliman are both very prominent language poets. Ron Silliman at the time, I think it is now defunct, but he published a very widely read poetry blog. When I was in college, it was the hot shit. So she writes a note to Ron Silliman saying, hey, you should read this little chapbook. And I don't know if she encouraged Massey to or if he was already sending one, but after she sent that note to Ron Silliman, Massey sent a copy of the chapbook. And Silliman read it, and he praised the chapbook in 2002. He praised it on his blog. From then on, Massey starts getting reviews. So he publishes in various magazines, and he publishes a number of little chapbooks. For a while, he starts getting reviewed in the San Francisco Chronicle and various other places. Steph Burt, at the time publishing, so Stephanie Burt, before her transition, wrote a lot about Joseph Massey. Like sort of Massey was a pet of hers in terms of like a favorite young up and coming poet. And so he was getting lots of endorsement from pretty prominent poets. In 2006, Ray Armantrout wrote a blurb endorsement preface to some poems of his in American Poet, which is the journal of the Academy of American Poets. Massey's poems started showing up in Poetry Daily. Or actually, I'm sorry, not Poetry Daily, Poem a Day, the Academy of American Poets version of Poetry Daily. In 2009, he publishes his first full-length collection, Areas of Fog. And in addition to various other reviews, Steph Burt in May writes one of her sort of overview pieces about the state of contemporary poetry, in which she attempted to coin a new term. I think I vaguely remember hearing about this at the time and have not heard it. I mean, maybe I'm out of the loop, but I have not heard many people talk about the new thing in contemporary poetry. But this was what Burt's review was all about. It was an overview of contemporary poetry in which she said, these are the poets of the new thing, which she capitalized, and she includes a page or so of praise for Massey in this pretty high profile, prestigious coverage of important current poets. Maybe the most extreme praise that I was able to find for Massey was in 2013. Burt writes in the Boston Review responding to, so Mark Edmondson around this time wrote a long essay in Harper's Magazine. I remember I bought the issue it was in because I was sort of curious, and he tore into contemporary poetry. I think his main argument was that it was too navel-gazing, and it was not appealing to a wide audience, and it was not addressing a great public. It was just sort of whispering into one's own navel. And Burt, lots of people wrote responses to this piece saying, nay, you know nothing of our work. And Burt was one of these, and she wrote a retort to this essay in the Boston Review. And in that retort, this quotation was plucked by a number of different people, including Poetry Magazine, which sort of raised an eyebrow. So like, whoa, all right. So what Burt said, among other things, and just in responding to this attack on contemporary poetry, she said, "I can say till I'm blue that Joseph Massey's short poems are the best thing to happen to the sense of vision since the invention of photography." I'm going to say that again. Steph Burt said in 2013 in the Boston Review, "I can say till I'm blue that Joseph Massey's short poems are the best thing to happen to the sense of vision since the invention of photography." Okay. Mind you, the invention of photography is like 150, 170 years old at this point. So that's including, motion pictures. That's including laser eye surgery. It's remarkable claim. Including the Hubble telescope. Remarkable claim. But Joseph Massey's short poems are the best thing to happen to the sense of vision since the invention of photography. So the point is, he was getting a lot of praise from a lot of fancy people. He was doing readings with fancy people. He was getting listed in roundups. He acquired a fair amount of real prestige during this period. He was also drinking a lot. So he is now sober in recovery, but he was a heavy drinker. I mean, by his own admission, and other people, did not dispute this. He was a very heavy drinker. He had a problem with his temper. He got charged with battery in California. His story was that he ate a pot brownie by accident and then went to the emergency room and ended up being charged with battery and grievous bodily injury. He says he stumbled and fell into somebody in the emergency room. So he had a temper. There's a lot of stories of him screaming at people, him saying mean things to people. He was honestly, sounds like a nightmare to be around. There are a couple other stories from this period, but I'm going to keep moving for now. In 2014, he publishes another collection called To Keep Time with Omnidawn. He gets positive reviews. And crucially, fatefully, he gets an invitation by email from Kate Colby. Now, in the progressive accounts of this case, Kate Colby's name is always left out. In most cases, there's not even a person who could be Kate Colby who's mentioned. And then in the sort of the big piece in the outline that was a sort of a big splashy overview of the case, she's granted a pseudonym. The writer calls her Sarah. For a number of reasons, one being, I think, some really serious problems with that piece in the outline, and the fact that Kate Colby is elsewhere online in many, many, many places identified as the person here, the person who plays this particular role. I'm going to use her name here. I think the grant of anonymity in the case of that outline article is pretty dubious. Honestly, even the inclusion is dubious, but I think it is really it would be bad practice not to name her now. And this is not new. There's no news breaking here. I mean, this is very, very well known, very well documented online, and a Twitter personality who honestly seems like kind of a nightmare in her own right. Gina Hugh cataloged some serious receipts. So I think it's pretty much not in doubt. So Kate Colby invites Massey to read in a reading series that she runs in 2014. Soon after that, they begin an affair. So Colby is married, Massey is not. They begin an affair. According to her, she drives to his house every couple months, and both of them are drinking very heavily during this period. Colby writes a lot of love letters to Massey. Some of the specific language that's documented is documented by Massey himself. And so I always want to sort of couch any claim he makes within those terms. However, he's pretty specific and pretty consistent, and he produces a lot of, I think he is pretty scrupulously reporting from emails and text messages. He is doing so for his own sake, and he is doing so as, again, I can't say it enough, a huge prick. This guy is truly the worst. So I want to give an accurate account of the story, which means at times I want to qualify the disparagement that people have directed toward him. But at no point should that be taken as a defense of him, because holy shit, what a fucking nightmare this guy was. So it does seem pretty clear she was writing a lot of love letters. In fact, more than one source has identified a lot of the love letters or love poems in her collection. The arrangements, a couple different sources have identified the subject of those poems as Massey. In 2015, there's sort of a big development. Massey publishes a book called Illocality with Wave Books. Very cool sort of hipster press. I became aware of them because they published Katie Lederer and Joshua Beckman and Matthew Rohr, and I think did they publish Chelsea Minnis, or I think they later published her. But a lot of very cool people. Massey publishes Illocality with Wave Books, and he really starts getting some very high-profile reviews. Steph Burt, his champion, reviews it positively in the New York Times and also includes it in a Poetry Spotlight sort of roundup article in the San Francisco Chronicle. So he's got some street cred. I think somewhat importantly, he is not the editor of a magazine. He is not a professor. He occasionally fills in as an instructor for an online course, the massive online course. This is, I believe, the same course that Alice took way back when, ModPo. I should say, pretty much nobody in this story comes out looking great. The one exception I would say of Ray Armentrout, for whom I have a defense of Ray Armentrout, but I think most people in this story come out looking, in the best case, like Steph Burt, who's a booster, who's a fluff artist. It's like writing fluff about poetry and just trying to create excitement for no good reason. And then I think there's some really, really despicable behavior, including by Massey, who, again, sucks so much. But like a lot of people come off looking really badly in this story. One of whom doesn't come off looking great is Al Filreis. But I will give him a pass. Al Filreis is hereby pardoned by SLEERICKETS for nothing heinous, no grossness, but just maybe a little bit of moral flexibility when it came to when precisely he was offended by bad behavior. But again, total pardon granted to Alfil Rees because he was one of the reasons that Alice really got into poetry in the serious way she did when she did. So for that one lasting good deed, Alfil Rees, you also receive unconditional immunity. So Massey publishes A Locality with Way Books, starts getting lots of big reviews, lots of attention. Kate Colby publishes the chapbook Engine Light with Pressboard, also in 2015. In the acknowledgments page for Engine Light, Kate Colby's book, her thank yous are: thank you to Darcy Denigan and Kate Shapira for their work on these poems, and to Joseph Massey for provoking them. In Massey's copy of the book, on December 11th, 2015, she writes, Joe, all for you, nothing without you, XX Kate. I don't bring this up to embarrass her, but I do bring it up to sort of to give, I think, an accurate sense of what was going on, which is that they were having a fairly intense love affair. And they were both drinking a lot. They were deeply involved in poetry. They cared a lot about poetry. They cared a lot about each other. I have no claims about the moral value of this relationship, but it was a pretty sincere relationship in which she was very invested. In February 2017, not the first shitty thing Joseph Massey does, but maybe the most fateful shitty thing he does. Not the worst or the first, but this is the big hinge, I think. In February 2017, he anonymously writes an anonymous Facebook message to Kate's husband informing her about the affair. I mean, this sucks so much. Like, this is such a low-down, dirty, gutless, lily-livered piece of shit thing to do. Like, have an affair with a married woman and then anonymously Facebook message her husband to rat her out. It sucks so much. So much. She calls him. They have a screaming fight over the phone. He says horrible, horrible things to her. She says horrible, horrible things to him. They are both very unhappy with each other. I think she has the better case. I think she has deceiving one's husband is bad. It's between the two of them, though. I think in this case, Massey's more despicable. They have a big fight. They scream and scream and scream. April 15th, which is so this is February. They have this big fight, blow up. And then April 15th, she emails him and he reports the content of them. She confirms this email. He reports the content of this email, which again, I think given that he's doing it a full year after most of this stuff comes out and is very specific in his language and is putting it in print in a fact-checked magazine, I think it's fairly accurate. He says, she writes in this email, I have been in hell and don't know where you're at, but I think one way forward for me would be to try to clear the air. Let me know if you want. If you don't, please just don't respond. The next day, they have a phone conversation. They both apologize to each other. They make up. They find a way to get along. In October of 2017, things start happening. An anonymous letter is sent to UGA Press, which published one of his other books, informing them that Massey has been verbally abusive to another poet. The press contacts Massey, asks him, what the hell? What is this about? In November, the following month, an anonymous letter goes out to Wave Books, Wesleyan University Press, Barrel House Magazine, where Massey was doing a workshop, and the Kelly Writers House at UPenn, where he was doing the online ModPo course. This anonymous letter, the same letter sent to these four places, all deeply involved with Massey. The letter calls Massey a predator and alleges that he has abused, and this is the language from the letter, up to almost 10 women, and then makes the claim, I'm anonymous because I don't know how to help in this situation without getting in trouble with employers, literary establishments, or Massey himself, whose positive literary reputation and wide networks would allow him the ability to make accusers look like liars if he wanted to. In late 2017, around the same time, Massey posts and later deletes an apology on Facebook. In the apology, he says, "I was argumentative, nasty at times, and a very bad drunk." He says he's going to pull his book from Wesleyan, and he's going to withdraw from the poetry world at large. On January 8th, 2018, this is, by the way, just for timeline's sake. I think notably, in October 2017, when the first letter goes out, is when the New Yorker reports that a number of women have accused Harvey Weinstein of sexual harassment or assault. And then this follow-up reporting and investigation over the months that follow. But that October is the big break. The Me Too movement begins to go viral around the same time, mid-October. So it is right around the same time that this is coming out, and the big anonymous letter comes out in November, so the month after this. In January 8th, 2018, an anonymous blog goes up online, and the anonymous blog just prints the letter that was sent anonymously, and the blog is titled "The Poet Joseph Massey is an Abuser." 2 days later, several things happen. January 10th, and this is where Gina Hughes' documentation is pretty helpful. And again, she seems like she's got her own agenda, but she also seems to have done her homework. So on January 10th, Kate Colby posts a note on Facebook calling Massey a serial abuser and sharing a link to the website. The Poet Joseph Massey is an Abuser. Kate Shapira, who is a friend of Colby's, she tweets, "Women I know and care about have suffered from Joseph Massey's predatory behavior, so I am sharing this letter, which became public today, and which is not from any of them as far as I know." The same day, Barrel House magazine posts that they are, they support victims of abuse, and they deny that they ever received the anonymous letter, and they announce that his workshop's canceled. So at this point, his book has been pulled, his workshop's been canceled, his involvement with Kelly Writer's House at UPenn has been rescinded, and all of the people who were praising him months before denounce him. And then so Wesleyan University Press didn't pull his book. It based on their account of they do a lot of hemming and hawing. They indefinitely suspend the book or indefinitely delay the book, but basically what it sounds like is they didn't have the language in their contract because Me Too wasn't a thing when they wrote up that contract, and so they were trying to basically stall. And Massey saw that they were going to be stalling and went ahead and pulled the book, which, shortly after that, they announced that they had updated their ethics guidelines and contract language. So around the same time, the Academy of American Poets scrubs their website of references to Massey. They pull the poems of his that were published on there. They pull reviews of his that were posted there. So Massey reports that in some detail, and I was able to confirm by doing some sleuthing and some Wayback Machine sniffing that they once did post his material on their website, and they did pull it. And in correspondence with him, they neither confirmed nor denied having done that. April 5th, I would say probably the most responsible piece of journalism written on this case was published. And it was published in the student newspaper, the Wesleyan Argus. Shane shared this article. It's flawed. It's written by several students. Emmett Tarrant, Hannah Reel, and Molly Schiff. It's published on April 5th, 2018. The article is titled "Poet Massey Withdraws Book from Wesleyan UP After Abuse Allegations Surface." So they don't do everything perfectly. They misspell the name of his most famous book. But they get a pretty candid interview with him. And they do a lot of confirmation of specific details. The big allegations are two. The letter that came out, the anonymous letter, says, how long is this? The anonymous letter has an update pointing to these two specific physical abuse instances, physical abuse or assault. But the letter itself basically says that he was verbally and psychologically abusive. He was never anybody's teacher or boss or director or editor or judge, but he did have a lot of prestige in the poetry world. The letter says, many accounts include ways in which Massey shows a classic grooming pattern with women and then later has serious long-term episodes of inflicting psychological abuse on them, including but not limited to severe name-calling, bullying, and unrelenting verbal abuse, blaming victims for symptoms of what he considers as mental illness, and using depression, anxiety as an excuse for predation, alienating and gaslighting victims, and threatening to harm victims' public and personal reputations. The letter is heavy on adjectives and a little bit light on details. The letter writer, who remains anonymous, says, the first time I met him, he was the star poet at a reading. He was extremely drunk and told me several times in front of a large crowd of published writers and my partner that he thought I was hot. I ignored it because every time he said it, he would then loudly cite depression and anxiety as reasons for acting out. It seemed this was his public persona. Everyone's attitude was, it's just Joseph being Joseph. So the letter that went out to the magazines, to the publishers that sort of caused all of this to kick off, didn't identify any criminal behavior, and it didn't actually identify any abuse of power because there was no power concretely to abuse. There's more discussion of that later, but what power means exactly. But I do think there's sort of like a worthwhile distinction to be made here that like Joseph Massey unquestionably had a great deal of prestige in the poetry world. But I do think there's like actually quite a difference between power and prestige. I think that there are people who have both. I think if you have a lot of power in the poetry world, it is difficult for that not to be accompanied by prestige. But I do think that like to name somebody who has terrible idea. But like somebody who is, I think, has a great deal of prestige in at least the poetry world I know, extremely well thought of, extremely well respected, but who has next to no power is Joshua Meakin. Right? Again, I hate to bring him up in the same general context as Joseph Massey, who sucks, is very well-rounded in his sucking because Joshua is like a very gentle, sweet, shy, crazy genius, right? And a wonderful, wonderful poet. But I think like it is very hard for me to think of a poet who does not respect him. But he truly just doesn't have a great deal of power. I mean, I think there are people who have more power, who edit series or direct programs, etc., who may not necessarily have quite as much prestige, and plenty of people have both. But I think Massey had a lot of prestige, and I don't think he had a lot of power, and I suspect that was partly because, as the letter writer points out, his public persona was that of being kind of a drunken lout. It's just Joseph being Joseph. Everybody sort of knew this, that he was always getting too drunk and yelling at people and hitting on people he shouldn't hit on. And so he wasn't really given power, but he did possess a great deal of prestige. And it's not that there's no relationship between those two, but I do think they're sort of significantly different things. And they are treated in most coverage of this case as being interchangeable. That is, the progressive-leaning coverage tends to say he's very powerful, and the conservative-leaning coverage tends to say he was a nobody. And neither of those is really true. What the Argus article brings to light is that the bad behavior was not just being a shithead. It was not just being too horny in public, too drunk in public, too angry or loud in public. It was two specific instances of physical bad behavior. The first one, and the one that is really not disputed at all, was that in 2009, at a poetry reading in Wendell, Mass., he stumbled up to a crowd of people who were standing around at the reading, including the poet Bridget Eileen, And in Eileen's words, she was quoted on the record by a name in the Argus article. She said, "He has not only assaulted me by grabbing my breasts in front of other people when he was highly intoxicated at a featured reading of his, but he also sent an apology message to me at the onset of the Me Too movement in regards to his behavior that night." And that's Eileen wrote that in a statement to Argus. And I assume by tacking the apology on there, she's saying he confirmed it. And he did confirm. I mean, he confirmed it to her in the apology, and he also confirmed it to the Argus. He claims that he was blacked out, but he also says he did it. The second allegation was by a woman who gets more detailed treatment in other articles. But the Argus piece says she was in a long-term relationship with Massey. This is not Kate Colby. The statement by the anonymous, this is actually, there's one anonymous statement here by this woman who is elsewhere called Emily. So I'll call her Emily. That's a pseudonym. But in the Argus article, she says, "He woke up out of a nap and instigated a fight. At the time, he was not drunk. I told him I felt uncomfortable being around him because he's menacing when he's angry. I told him I was going to drive back home. When I tried to leave his house, he managed to grab me by the ankles, pin me down, and hold me there. I was terrified and didn't know what to do. He was much bigger than me, and I thought that if I tried to fight back, he'd end me. I stayed through the night, thinking that if I didn't move and he went back to sleep, I would manage to make it to morning. In the morning, he behaved almost as though nothing had happened." Massey acknowledges the incident here. He also denies it elsewhere. I'll read what he said, because I do think it's a little bit telling. Because again, no matter what qualifications I might offer here, can't say it enough. Huge piece of shit. Like, terrible. Just awful. Massey acknowledged this incident, but he claimed that he was inebriated and as a result does not remember it. "We were both intoxicated. We were arguing," he said, and she wanted to leave. And from what I understand, she is claiming that I held her ankles and wouldn't let her leave. Massey said, "I don't remember doing that, but I'm sure I did. I don't remember it, but that doesn't mean I'm denying it. That weekend she didn't leave. There was no kidnapping. I mean, I held her ankles during an argument and then we talked about it. The only incident in my life that could be construed as sexual assault was at that reading," referring to the time he grabbed Bridget Eileen's breasts. So those are the two instances that are sort of physical transgressions. A pattern I recognized in a lot of his statements and in the Facebook apology that he posted as well is one that if you spend a lot of time talking to chronically depressed people, especially people with addiction, then there's a certain kind of apology you will sometimes hear, which is the overboard apology. Not only did I do this thing that you didn't like, but I'm worthless and I should be flushed into the void of space and erased from history. And a lot of his sort of acknowledgments of things he did while blacked out have this quality to my ear. The apology he posted on Facebook, just for reference, and considering the climate we're in when so many truly fucking evil men are being called out and brought down, I think it's best for me to drop out of poetry completely rather than upset people who have nothing to do with it. If I've written a blurb for you recently or anything of the sort, please pull it and ask someone else to write one for you. I will also be pulling my forthcoming book. I can't live knowing there are people out there who want to ruin my life, so I'd rather move on without struggle. My plan is to fully commit myself to a spiritual life, which I've been contemplating anyway. I am sorry to disappoint so many of you. I am truly sorry. Again, I don't want to question anybody's intentions about the spiritual life, but it does feel to me like a sort of a self-consciously overboard apology. And why don't I just stop existing while we're at it? And so I don't. Much as I believe he's a huge piece of shit, much as I believe he did some awful, awful things, including probably these physical things, I take some of his blackout acknowledgments to the Argus with a grain of salt. The grain of salt being like, you're being a shithead even in how you apologize, and I don't, like, you're making it difficult for me to even glean any information from what you're saying. But this is the article that's published in the Argus. It does seem like it's pretty clear Massey, setting aside the general shittiness of his behavior, in social settings or in intimate settings, he crossed some real lines. I do think it's maybe worth noting what he says later about the relationship with Emily, which is the woman whose ankles he says he doesn't remember grabbing, but he says, I'm sure I did. Here's what he says about her. And again, I say this not to impugn her. I say this not to either vindicate him or diminish her, but I think it is sort of some meaningful context. He says, I remember arguments. I remember Emily once punching me hard in the chest on 2 occasions, once while walking home from a bar in Arcata and once while walking home from a bar in Seattle. In front of traffic and pedestrians, she put her hand down my pants and pulled my penis out. She thought it was hilarious. Yeah, this seems like it's in the same pattern of mutually shitty, very drunk love affairs or sex affairs. And that somebody else was shitty to him doesn't excuse anything he did. But I do think it's maybe clarifying context. The month after the Argus piece comes out, a much longer piece comes out in The Outline, which is much more prominent. It was a professional outlet, a much more prominent outlet. It went belly up, but at the time it was a multi-million-dollar media venture, and this is a place that hired staff away from Vox, Vice, and BuzzFeed. So it's this is a serious publication. This article is called "The Poet Joseph Massey's Disturbing History of Abuse," with the deck being multiple women claim he used his influence in the poetry community to harass and manipulate them. This is by Rebecca Kirkman, and I think this article is terrible. I think it is really irresponsible, really, really badly done. This one begins with a description of Kate Colby's relationship with Massey. It's a 700-word description, and in it, she makes no accusations. She describes him being a jerk, but not abusing any power, not doing anything criminal, not doing anything she didn't do to him. It's just a description of a shitty, unhealthy relationship in which they were both very jealous of each other, maybe without any good reason, except that she was cheating on her husband with him. Yeah, he's awful to her, and he anonymously informs her husband and then calls her lots of horrible names over the phone. In this story, however, there's an additional detail. Here's the last couple paragraphs of that section of the article. That April, so Sarah is the name given to Colby in this article. That April, Sarah emailed Massey in an attempt to make peace. Around the same time, she began to reach out to other women who had been involved with him and learned about how he hurt them as well. When she heard about these women's experiences, she blocked Massey on social media and stopped communicating with him. So she emailed Massey to make peace and began emailing women he had been involved with and learned about how he hurt them as well. So I guess the idea is that she started writing to other women he'd been involved with, and they told her bad things he'd done. She doesn't say what she was writing to them, but it seems like a fairly reasonable inference that she was writing to them asking if he'd hurt them, if he'd done things to them, if he had behaved badly. And she says, and it was just sort of like one after one. They were all, I guess that's supposed to be one after another. They were all like the same story, Sarah said. And most of them are quite a bit younger than I am and less established. I felt embarrassed that I had believed it was just me. So he's had a lot of relationships which were drunk and crummy and maybe abusive. Piece of shit. Piece just sucks. Just a guy who sucks. The bulk of this article is anonymous narratives with pseudonymous women, none of whom there's Emily, who has the claim about being grabbed by the ankles, but most of these women either have minimal exposure to him at all. I mean, one of them is just an email relationship in which he talked meanly about other people. And then this is news. This is like a source in an article. A woman who slept with him once and says I will begrudgingly say it was consensual, but he was a jerk. And that's news. This is, Kirkman says the line that made me want to pull my hair out. She said, Sarah estimated, this is Kirkman writing, she says of Colby, she says, Sarah estimated that she talked to 10 to 15 people who have experienced some form of Massey's harassment or abuse. I interviewed 13 people, this is Kirkman, I interviewed 13 people who'd experienced or witnessed his behavior, online harassment, physical assault, verbal abuse, psychological abuse. They'd experienced or witnessed one of these over the last 12 years. 7 agreed to go on the record, some anonymously, for this article. That's the part that made me crazy. 7 agreed to go on the record, some anonymously. Well, most anonymously, and that's not going on the record. That's not what the record is. Kirkman really, really harps on the power question. You can even imagine this mutually highly annoying conversation she refers to, in which she's interviewing Massey and she and he start arguing with each other about power. Massey denied to me that he abused his power. In fact, he denied that he even has power to abuse, partly because of his poverty and his upbringing, but also because he says his access to institutions and presses is somewhat marginal compared to the rare poets who gain huge followings and deal with major presses. This, of course, ignores the fact that getting one's work published and noticed at all requires clout and connections, which are a definite kind of power. And he pointed out several of the organizations with whom he has worked have now dropped him. Well, yeah, I mean, I think first, getting one's work published and noticed at all requires clout and connections is not really true. It is often true that having clout and connections gets one published, but it's not true that getting one's work published or noticed at all requires clout and connections. And it's also not clear that there's significant power attached to that, at least in the case of Massey. And what was certainly true by the time she talked to him was that the organizations that affiliated themselves with him had all dropped him, had all denounced him. All right. So there turns out to be a fairly important set of additional details. When Massey and Colby broke up, so he did the horrible, shitty, cowardly thing of, he did, to his credit, he does call it cowardly, anonymously tipping off her husband, ratting her out. They have a yelling, screaming fit. He's horrible to her over the phone. Then they make up. And then there's this other little detail that gets left out, which is that 11 days, as he says, after he and Colby made up, he got his manuscript accepted by Wesleyan University Press. And it turns out, this is sort of the crucial detail, Wesleyan University Press was not just a prestigious press to get one's poetry published by. It was also the press Kate Colby had twice submitted manuscripts to and been rejected by. So they both say that in April 2017, after having made up, she then cut him off, stopped communicating, blocked him on all social media. They both say that happened. She says it happened because at the same time that she was writing him to make up with him, she was also writing other women, asking them about their experiences with him. When she heard about these women's experiences, she blocked Massey on social media and stopped communicating with him. So that's Kate Colby's version. Massey's version is that when I told Kate that Wesleyan wanted my book, she cut off all contact. I was blocked on all social media and she refused to respond to my messages. He later quotes an email of hers. And to my knowledge, nobody has disputed this language. So July 6th, again, he's very specific with the dates, July 6th. So April, they make up and then unmake up. July, top of July, Colby sends an email to Massey. And the end of the email is, then you decided to, it's a list of bad things he's done, which I believe he's done. I believe you could fill a very long list with bad things he's done because this guy sucks and nobody should work with him regardless. There's so many good reasons not to publish this guy, not to do readings with this guy, not to be associated with this guy. But she writes to him, "Then you decided to tell me that my personal dream press, over which I've worked so hard and suffered a lot of pain, is publishing your book." So that was the end of the email, and that was the capstone. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. That was the final item in the list of grievances she had with Massey. Was, you told me that Wesleyan University Press was publishing your book after they'd rejected me twice. That was July 6th. In October, an anonymous letter goes to UGA Press. In November, the anonymous letter goes to Wave, Wesleyan, Barrel House, and Kelly Writer's House. Again, 2 days after the anonymous blog, the poet Joseph Massey is an abuser, appears online, Kate Colby posts a note on Facebook sharing a link. Gina Hugh goes to great lengths to try to prove that Kate Shapiro is lying when she says she doesn't know the author of the letter. I'm not as interested in trying to pin that down, but it does seem true that Kate Shapiro was very aware of Colby's sincere love for Massey during the affair, and seemed to be a close confidant of Colby's and very, very familiar with Massey and pretty familiar with the whole inside of the affair. I'm less interested in trying to figure out what the precise bad or good faith of Kate Shapiro is. I should also say, though, that that Gina Hugh was doing so much, clearly was getting some information from Massey and was also doing so much work on his behalf that it made me a little bit suspicious. So I did look her up, and she does appear to be a real person with actual significant followers and somebody who also writes about lots of other stuff, not just in this one stretch of time. Similarly, I saw the Argus piece got, I think, some really unwarranted abuse from some friends of Massey's, calling it unethical and saying that this was a smear job. But I do think it's true that Massey did have some friends who thought he was being ill-treated, or at least that there was another big part of the story that was not being told, which was that this was revenge. This was Kate Colby's revenge for Massey ratting her out to her husband, and then rubbing salt in her wounds by getting a publication with Wesleyan University Press, right? I think between Gina Hugh and Massey's own writing, I think there's a pretty strong case that this cancellation was an act of revenge by Colby, and that he says she orchestrated the other allegations. He says she paid the other people, and Kirkman follows up with all of them and asks, and they all deny having received money from her. I think it seems pretty unlikely that they received money from her. It does seem, even by, Sarah's own account in the anonymous story, it seems pretty clear that she did also write to other women who had dated him, asking for reports of bad behavior. That does seem to be the case. And this didn't come out until the Me Too movement had really taken off. So, yeah, I think there's a pretty strong case that this was sort of a spiteful act of revenge by Colby. Now, again, and Kirkman, Rebecca Kirkman wrote this really, really awful, really bad, really badly done article in the outline, and all of the organizations and other people who had praised him and who had been associated with him and who had been the ones who said, that's just Joseph being Joseph, and, what are you going to do? And who seemed to be completely aware, at least, of his loud, drunken, nasty, breast-grabbing, shitty behavior, that all of these same people who seemed quite aware of all of that were suddenly conscience-struck and distancing themselves from him. Not because they had responded that way to his behavior, but because they responded that way to the sudden publicity and coverage and the changing of the zeitgeist. I mean, that seems pretty clear. Just because I thought it was sort of funny, I looked up on the Academy of American Poets. They adopted around the time of the Me Too. Again, as many people have pointed out, Tarana Burke started Me Too well before the various white Hollywood actresses did, but it became really viral in 2017. So around this time, the Academy of American Poets adopted this new sort of ethical set of guidelines, and here's what it says. They put this on the website. It says, our staff today, they said, we're not just a poetry organization. We don't just post whatever poems are on here no matter what. Our staff today seeks to promote poets we believe reflect artistic excellence in our contemporary context and, to the best of our knowledge, consistent with our organizational value of integrity. And that seems to be not quite grammatically correct. Our staff seeks to promote poets we believe reflect artistic excellence and consistent with behave in a way that is consistent. Yeah, it's not grammatically correct. Consistent with our organizational value of integrity, we are under no obligation to publish or promote any poet or their work, right? Fair enough. You say, okay, we're not just a poetry organization. We support a community. So we are interested in reflecting artistic excellence in our contemporary context, things that we consider artistically excellent today, and to the best of our knowledge, that are consistent with our organizational value of integrity. We don't want to publish or promote people whose behavior is not consistent with our organizational value of integrity, because we're under no obligation to publish or promote any poet or their work. So just for shits and giggles, I typed in a handful of names. There are other names I could have come up with, but just for the heck of it, I figured I would type in a few names. These are not all criminals. These are just sometimes people who sort of behaved in like a Massey-esque, crummy way, being rude, being thoughtless, being careless, being mean. Some of them are also criminals. These are not just a list of how many results there were. There were too many results. So I'm listing them by the number of pages of results that there were for each of these poets. So there was 1 page of search results for Reginald Dwayne Betts, who was convicted of committing armed robbery and who speaks openly about having committed armed robbery. There are 2 pages of search results for Paul Verlaine, who shot Arthur Rimbaud. There are 2 pages of search results for Francois Villon, who murdered a priest. There are 4 pages of search results for Lord Byron, who raped little boys. There are 5 pages of search results for Percy B. Shelley, who impregnated a 16-year-old, abandoned her, and then she drowned herself. There's 6 pages of search results for Derek Walcott, who allegedly groped students and traded grades for sex, or even more often, traded not grades for not sex. There are 9 pages of search results who wrote publicly about raping a house servant. Shane was kind enough to point out. There's 16 pages of search results for Robert Lowell, who didn't commit a crime necessarily, but did drive drunk and get in a wreck which resulted in his wife's severe facial disfigurement. And there are 21 pages of search results for Ezra Pound, who recorded wartime propaganda broadcasts for Mussolini, openly promoted the arrest and mass extermination of the Jews, and wrote the following sentence the day Germany surrendered in 1945. He wrote, "I think that Hitler was a saint and wanted nothing for himself." Now, to be clear, I think all of these are wonderful poets. Pablo Neruda, sometimes. But I love poetry by pretty much all of these guys. And I think it's very, very good that the Academy of American Poets includes their poems on its website. I have other thoughts about Joseph Massey's poems, but I'm just saying that the reason they took his poems down is not because his behavior was not consistent with their organizational value of integrity. That's not why they took down the poems. It would be ridiculous to claim that that's why. They took them down because he became publicly toxic and they didn't want to be associated with him. Again, this was not punishment for behavior, real, actual bad behavior, which really did happen and which he did and which he sucks for. But this was about publicity. And I think that was the same thing for the Kelly Writers House and Barrel House and the Wesleyan University Press. I think that's pretty clear. So I think the canceling campaign was an act of revenge, and the canceling itself was an act of ass covering, but couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. Boy, did he deserve it. This guy sucks so much. And this brings us maybe to what I think this whole story is actually about. So, I mean, to follow up the timeline, I'll just say, like, after he got canceled, after he left respectable poetry behind, he gets his book published, A New Silence, by a little, I think it's an overseas press that just seems sort of indifferent to, the relevant publicity questions. 2021, he's confirmed with the Catholic Church, which, I don't want to speak ill of anybody's conversion, but I confess to a slight suspicion of all of these non-Catholics suddenly converting to Catholicism in the 2020s and also becoming Republicans or like doubling down. Like, I confess a little skepticism of that. Like, as a born and raised Catholic, I've always been taught by my family to be suspicious of converts because converts are fucking crazy. Not always true. Clearly, there's some wonderful converts, but I confess personal prejudice. If you were not Catholic before, but now you're really enthusiastic about conservative politics and you got confirmed as a Catholic in the 2020s, I am suspicious of you. And that's probably unfair, surely unfair. In 2022, he founded the Exile Press, which he says is basically a press that exists exclusively to publish his own work. In 2024, the Exile Press publishes his most recent book, which is called Decades, and it's selected poems. In 2025, another really big turn for Massey. He appears on the Megyn Kelly show. Apparently, she had followed him online for a while before that, and she is a huge fan. She has said numerous times, she's had him on the show multiple times, and she says Joseph Massey is her favorite poet. She gives him a big boost. In April 2025, the Free Press publishes an article called The Unofficial Poet Laureate of Trump's America that is all about Massey. His most recent book is a bestseller. I'm pretty sure that no Democrats bought it. So, the progressives, the respectable poetry people, say that this is a story all about individual bad behavior. And to be clear, there was a lot of individual bad behavior. Massey sucks. Right? The conservatives are convinced that this is a story about bad collective behavior. This is a story about the evils of cancel culture. And I think it sort of is. Like, I think this is a bad, this was bad collective behavior and bad individual behavior. I think this was about shitty, crummy, aggressive, drunken, male, presumptuous, sexual, again, like predator power, and that he was powerful and that he was a predator feel to me like it's just hard to pin those meanings down in any strict sense and I feel really confident about them. It seems more accurate to say he was a prestigious asshole who was tolerated in public bad behavior because of his prestige and extended that public bad behavior at times to private bad behavior and doesn't seem to have committed a lot of physical assaults. Again, no number is acceptable. One physical assault is not acceptable. But I do think it's slightly misleading to say that he was a powerful predator in the poetry world, which does seem to be the party line among progressives. I think he was a piece of shit who was really, really bad to the people around him, really specifically bad to the women around him, who crossed some lines, who probably could have been charged with some crimes, maybe should have been. But I also think this is a story about crummy, collective, reflexive, vengeful, cancel culture behavior. Like, I think all of those things are true. It is truly a story populated by assholes. But I think what is really at the heart of this story, what it's really finally about, is bad poetry. And this is where I know some people will also really disagree with me. And I think among my serious poetry friends, I don't think anybody would try to defend the poems he writes now, which are often, explicitly, right-leaning. The funniest instance is he did an interview with. The funniest thing he did, the most funny, stupid thing he did, is he wrote an inaugural poem on spec. if you don't know what on spec means, it means you write something in hopes that it will be accepted, published, produced, whatever. People write a lot of screenplays on spec, but he wrote an inaugural poem on spec, the worst category of poem, the worst subgenre. He wrote an inaugural poem on spec for Donald Trump. He really wanted to give read an inaugural poem at Trump's second inauguration. So he wrote this poem. He claims that, he's got some friends in high places and they were working on it and trying to make it happen, but it didn't happen. Boo-hoo. But it was the interview with Liza Leibs. He began a sentence, and I just absolutely lost it when he said this. He began a sentence by saying, "If I do become the poet laureate," which she, in that conversation, seemed to think that poet laureate and reader of an inaugural poem were the same position. And so then when he said that, it made me think like, wait, does he think that too? What? But he wrote this poem. Here's what he said about it. "I put the word out that I wanted to be the inaugural poet. Even though that didn't happen, I heard from a few people pretty high up in the Trump world who were trying to make it happen and were putting in a good word for me. And I wrote this poem just in case I needed a poem on hand." And he wrote an absolute piece of dog shit. It's called America is the Poem. And here's the thing. I read this poem, and then I reread Praise Song for the Day, which is Elizabeth Alexander's shitty poem for Barack Obama's first presidential inauguration. And then I reread One Today, which is Richard Blanco's shitty poem for Barack Obama's second presidential inauguration. And here's the thing about Praise Song for the Day and One Today and America is the Poem. They're the same poem. These are all three the same shitty poem. They are a list of like flaccidly rendered, uninteresting vignettes from American life that basically just get summed up by a vague pronouncement that like, aren't we all America? In Elizabeth Alexander's, there's a little more acknowledgement of black people. In Richard Blanco's, there's a little more acknowledgement of non-English speaking people. In Joseph Massey's, there's a little more acknowledgement of like poor white people or patriotic people. But these are all the same poem. Here's Elizabeth Alexander. "Someone is trying to make music somewhere with a pair of wooden spoons on an oil drum, with cello, boombox, harmonica, voice. A woman and her son wait for the bus. A farm considers the changing sky. A teacher says, 'Take out your pencils, begin.'" Here's Richard Blanco. "The dust of farms and deserts, cities and plains mingled by one wind, our breath. Breathe, hear it, through the day's gorgeous din of honking cabs." Here's Joseph Massey. "We can see you now emerging from boarded-up corner bars, baseball fields barbed with weeds, hollowed-out churches and factories folded in on themselves, like crushed cans reclaimed by the wild." It's the same shit. And here's the point. I know some of my listeners are really going to disagree with me on this, but I think Joseph Massey is a bad poet. Now, again, none of them would disagree that his poems now are bad, but I think he was always a bad poet. And I want to be kind of specific about this because I think, as I said at some point, I think Ray Armantrout is the person who is in the best faith about him. Ron Silliman praises him in pretty lofty terms when he gives him his stamp of approval in 2002. Ray Armantrout in 2006 writes this essay about him. Here, she quotes these lines. Here is one more poem from Property Line. Actually, this is a whole poem. He writes these very, very short poems. So here's the whole poem. This is early Joseph Massey. This is the Joseph Massey everybody agreed was a genius. "Flies, sun-dried, line the windowsill. Measure what was summer." Here's what Armantrout says about this. "Whoever hears the term sun-dried applied to anything but tomatoes, by the way? Now you have. The mind behind this poem observes and measures, but doesn't tidy up. The property line dividing summer from autumn is made of dead flies. This line divides the past from the present, ostensibly, but the line itself seems a bit blurred. The words measure and summer reveal a good bit of overlap, a surprising kinship. They are mirror twins. Both are two-syllable words with stress on the first syllable. They differ mainly in how their consonants, the M and the S, are reversed. This demonstrated interchangeableness is not exactly proper. I think that Ray Armentrout, in this whole essay she writes, it's worth reading. It's called Precise Instability, Introducing Joseph Massey. It's written in 2006. I think she's in good faith with herself. I think she's honest. I think she's specific. I think she's describing what she cares about. What she cares about is poetry that is the primary virtue of which is surprisingness. If you can write poems that are surprising to somebody who's read a shit ton of poems, surprising choice, a surprising word, that's the primary virtue. Whoever hears the term sun-dried applied to anything but tomatoes, by the way. Now, I think there are other virtues. I think she's also very interested in sound. I think she's interested in, here's the thing. Everybody who publishes formal poetry knows that there are certain magazines that will publish anything that's written in form, right? They'll publish anything that's written in form. And that sucks, and they shouldn't do that. They see a poem and all they care about is that it's got meter, it's got rhyme, or one or the other. And that shouldn't happen, and that sucks. But I also think that there's a degree of baseline competence to that, right? If you can write in meter and rhyme, you've achieved a certain level of baseline competence. But I think that there is a complementary version of this in free verse poetry. And there are different free verse poetries. But I do think that in a certain camp of free verse poetry, in the Ray Armentrout camp, that writing with fresh language, with no dead skin, as I would say, right, where there are no phrases that are expected, where the sound is dense and fecund, right, measure, summer. She's right. There is a kind of a nice symmetry between those words. And where the imagery is striking. If you can write with fresh language, dense sound, and striking imagery, that's a kind of a baseline competence. Now, just writing poems like that is enough to get published in a lot of places. Just as writing poems that are nothing more than metrical and rhyming is enough to get published in other places. None of that should be the case. But all of those are virtues, right? Ideally, you should at least be capable of writing in meter and rhyme. You may not choose to do it, but you should be capable of writing in meter and rhyme. And you should also be writing with fresh language and dense fecund sound and striking imagery. Because those are competences. But they're not, and I think, there's, with formal verse, I think there's not just meter and rhyme, there's also regular alliteration is a slightly different thing than people think it is. But I think there are certain competencies that are worth developing and are also not enough. That's not the end of poetry. That's the beginning of poetry. And I think Joseph Massey wrote with fresh language, dense fecund sound, and striking imagery. And I think Ray Armentrout wrote an essay basically saying that. Saying, here's what his poetry is. This is what I like. She's not really guilty of anything in my eyes except having impoverished taste. Not that good poetry should not be these things, but that this is not enough. So I think Joseph Massey is a bad poet. I want to say one more thing about this. This is going to sound like a boast, but I promise you it's not. So I played a few games of chess online before starting this episode, and I did it because I wanted to make this point. And so I wanted to, I've been a little bit irregular with my chess. I play on a few different platforms with a few different accounts, but I mainly play on chess.com. I went to a couple of different accounts to kind of just test out, to make sure I was not crazy. So on chess.com, there are 230 million people who play on chess.com. It is by far the biggest platform. Everybody who is serious about chess at least sometimes plays on chess.com. The Lee Chess is a nonprofit. I also play on Lee Chess. But chess.com is the big one. And they have a rating system. Lee Chess also has a different rating system, but chess.com has a rating system. It's very familiar to any chess player. It's fairly standardized. It's pretty reliable. You get more points when you beat somebody better than you. You get fewer points. You lose more points when you lose to someone worse than you, and so on and so on. So I've been playing for 5 years. I have a couple different accounts, as I said, but let's see. On this account, my main account, SLEERICKETS. By the way, if you ever want to play me in chess, go to chess.com. I'm just SLEERICKETS, and my image is the logo in black and white. So I have played on this account. I have played 6,500 games. Played on another chess.com account I've played. No, the other chess account I've only played like 500 games, and then Elite Chess I played 1,000 something. I don't know, but I play a lot of games, anonymously, and if I'm feeling really tired, I play a lot of chess. I played for about 5 years now. I play at least a few games every single day. My rating for 10-minute chess, which is the most popular format, you each have 10 minutes flat on each side with no bonus time to play your whole game. So my rating for 10-minute chess is, wobbles up and down, but at the moment it's 1411. So being 1411 in 10-minute chess means I am better than 95% of the people on here, right? I'm in the top 5% of chess players on chess.com. Sounds like a boast, yeah? It's really not, because being rated 1411 is dog shit, is less than dog shit, is truly nothing. Like, statistically, I could probably beat you in chess, who are like, I'm sure, actually, I know there's some serious chess players who listen, and I know I couldn't beat you, but like, for most of you, I could probably beat you in chess. I could probably beat most, like, of my friends or family, but like, what are we talking about? There are real chess players out there. There are national masters. There are international masters. There are people who are just regular tournament FIDE players who have like a FIDE rating of 1,600. There's so like my cousin JP, who like does numbers for our family furniture company. He's better than me. Being 1411 is nothing. And if there were to be a chess exhibition, if you were to interview a chess player, and you interviewed me, you would be a fucking idiot, right? That would be an irresponsible representation of chess. As an absolute amateur who's relatively new to the game, I'm fine. But it would be laughable to call what I do good chess. So when I say that Joseph Massey is a bad poet, and here's where I'm going to really step in it, the names of the other poets who came up in this scandal: Bridget Eileen, Kate Colby, Anne Boyer. I know some of you may like Anne Boyer. Caitlin, there's another Caitlin who was quoted in the piece. There are a number of different poets who were quoted in this piece. I read as many poems as I could find by all of them. I didn't buy books, but I read like a lot of them had won prizes. A lot of them had been published in prominent places. I read all the poems that were on the Poetry Foundation website, went to other websites, Academy of American Poets. I read all the poems I could find online from all of these people, and I didn't read a single good one. Kate Colby has published 10 books of poetry. Joseph Massey, between the chapbooks and the full-length books, has published like 15. That's insane. These people are not even 50. Like, it's insane even if they were the best poets. That would be, like, I doubt those are all strong books. I doubt they're strong all the way through. That's like, maybe you're doing a Richard Wilbur where you publish like a 60-page book and half the pages are blank and the font's really big, the type's really big. But like, it's laughable that these people are running programs, directing reading series, teaching at prestigious colleges. Joseph Massey didn't get good jobs, didn't get prominent positions. I think, again, because everybody knew he was such a prick. But he was praised to the heavens by Steph Burt, by Ron Silliman, by, again, Ray Armantrout, I think, is pretty careful in what she says. But the problem with this world was that they're all fucking bad poets, right? They're bad poets the way I'm a bad chess player. And yes, they'd been doing it longer than I've been doing chess. But you know what? They're still fucking bad. They're bad. I think this is part of the problem. Like with poetry, we spend so much time reading student poems or reading submissions that we think like, oh, that's kind of promising. Like if I read Joseph Massey's poems, I would say, oh, that's promising. Okay, yeah, who is this? Who's this kid? I'm kind of interested in what's going to happen next. I mean, honestly, not that promising. like, it would have to be a really bad day if I were to be excited by the promise of Joseph Massey's poems. But like as a student, yeah, this is better than nothing. It's got striking imagery and fresh language and dense fecund sound. Like that's not nothing. It's hard to do that. You don't see a lot of that. Just like you don't see a lot of people who can play chess as badly as I can. It's pretty hard to play chess as badly as I can. And you know what? It's still badly. It's still bad. It's still not actually meaningfully good. If we're going to talk about good poetry, we have to be talking about actually good poetry at a level that matters. Not at the level where you can look at some lines and say, there's some kind of interesting stuff going on with the sound here. No, show me a poem that breaks your heart. Show me a poem that you can't forget. Show me a poem that knocks your socks off. That's the baseline. That's the actual baseline for poetry worth talking about. You don't have YouTube channels discussing games by me. You have YouTube channels discussing games by grandmasters, by high-level grandmasters, by the best grandmasters, because that's what it means to talk about a pursuit at a level that matters, at a level that when you care about it. Joseph Massey and Kate Colby and all these other people were writing amateur shit. Some of it was better amateur shit than others. Some of it was quite bad. Some of it was appallingly bad. But it's amateurish. Some of it's promising amateurish work, but it's amateurish. And here's the thing. The reason he got kicked out was not because he was a piece of shit. It was because the winds disfavored him at this moment. And the reason he was tolerated and his shitty behavior was tolerated knowingly by so many of these people for so long was because he had prestige attached to him. And the reason, a lot of women approached him. Again, like, I don't want to make fun of anybody's sexual appeal, but reading about all of these people he dated, watching interviews with him, I just thought, like, is he really good in bed? Is he a really good lay? Like, does he just have amazing game? Because you usually get some inkling of the game, right? When somebody's talking, you usually get like, oh, he's kind of funny. Oh, he's kind of charming. I mean, holy shit. Like, this was people trading sex appeal for prestige and tolerance of bad behavior for proximity. This was a world in which people were willing to bet, bank, leverage, swap, borrow, prestige, sexiness, social connections, prominence, affiliation. People were willing to trade and bet on anything but poetry, anything but the actual quality of the actual poems, the kind of stratospheric praise that so many of these shitty poems, not just by Joseph Massey, but also by Kate Colby, by Bridget Eileen, by all of these people. There's nothing morally wrong with being a bad poet, but I think this is a world in which the actual things that mattered, right, the actual currency was anything but poetry. There is a whole other conversation to have about geniuses who abuse people, and that's a much more complicated conversation. But that's not the conversation that's relevant here, because there are no geniuses on hand. This is a bunch of people who either are swapping the emperor's new clothes with one another, or seem, in the case of Ray Armantrout and to some extent Ron Silliman, and maybe Steph Bird, although Steph Bird I think is as smart as she is and as learned as she is, which she is. She's very smart, very learned, very quick, very clever. I think she is also a bullshit artist. I think she is also an unapologetic poetry booster who's just willing to say anything to promote the goodness of poetry overall, and who loves getting excited about some new thing. And then in the case of Ray Armantrout and Ron Silliman, these are just people who maybe actually sincerely find boring poetry interesting. But I think when you hollow out the actual concern of your enterprise, of your community, if you carve out the actual question of good poetry, actually good poetry, then you're left with a social and artistic community that is founded on anything but that. And that's how you get a Joseph Massey, and it's also how you get a Kate Colby, and it's how you get this whole fucking mess. So, in conclusion, was this cancel culture run amok? Yeah, kind of. Was this a piece of shit guy getting what he deserved? Yeah. yeah, kind of that as well. Was this a story of a talented poet wronged by an unjust system? No, it wasn't, because I don't think he's a talented poet. Or rather, he's as talented at poetry as I am at chess, which is not at all, right? Like, most people don't write bad poems as good as his bad poems, right? It's not easy to do. It's just not good enough to count. It's not good enough to be worth mentioning. So yeah, talentless prick wrongfully canceled. But that's not really what this is about. Really, this is a bad poet fight. I don't wish ill to anybody, least of all to Ray Armentrout, who wins the Diogenes One Honest Woman Award for being the one good faith actor in this hideous story. All right, this has gone on for fucking ever. I'm going to call it there. Thank you all for listening. Do sign up for The Secret Show at SLEERICKETS.substack.com. You can get week's access for free if you put in your email address, etc. You can write me if you're poor, give me more money if you're rich, and if you want to write a poem and get a listener crit, then join The Secret Show and send me a poem. Thank you all for listening, and with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.